Monday mornings always felt the same, a slow, quiet crawl through routines that had long since lost their meaning. My house, once brimming with noise, now echoed with the soft hum of appliances and the occasional creak of settling wood. It had been years since my children moved out, and longer since my husband and I quietly went our separate ways, though the divorce papers were never filed. That day, the sky was gray, the kind of muted tone that seemed to match my life. I grabbed my shopping list, more out of habit than necessity, and made my way to the local grocery store. The aisles were familiar, the fluorescent lights unflattering, and the air smelled faintly of bread and cleaning products. I was reaching for a jar of marinara sauce on a too-high shelf when I heard a voice behind me. "Let me help with that." I turned, and there he was, brown hair tousled, a warm smile that could have melted the frostiest morning. He was younger, likely in his late 20s or early 30s, and had an ease about him that caught me off guard. Without waiting for my response, he plucked the jar from the shelf and handed it to me. "Thank you," I managed, my voice coming out more formal than I intended. "No problem," he said, stepping aside with a playful bow. "Shopping can be a workout sometimes." I laughed softly, the sound surprising me as much as him. It had been ages since a stranger sparked even the faintest lightness in me. He introduced himself as Daniel, and over the next few aisles, we crossed paths repeatedly, exchanging brief comments about the absurd price of avocados or the lack of decent coffee brands. When we both reached the checkout line, he turned to me and said, "You must shop here often." "I've been here a few times, but I don't remember seeing you." I shrugged, suddenly aware of the cardigan I wore over a simple blouse, my hair tied back hastily. "It's part of my routine." "Routines are good," he said, his smile lingering. "But every now and then, it's nice to mix things up." I nodded, unsure of what to say. As I watched him walk away with his bag of groceries, a strange warmth lingered. For the first time in years, something about my day felt different, less predictable, less gray. I left the store with my usual groceries and a faint smile that I couldn't quite explain the next time I saw Daniel. It was almost serendipitous. I was in the bakery aisle, debating whether to indulge in a fresh loaf of sourdough, when his voice interrupted my thoughts. "Let me guess, you're trying to decide if it's worth the carbs." I turned, startled but pleasantly so. "And how would you know that?" He grinned, holding up a bag of bagels. "Because I'm doing the same thing. Although I've already lost this battle." We laughed, and somehow, the conversation extended beyond bread and calories. He told me he was a freelance graphic designer who worked odd hours and liked to cook when he could. I shared that I used to be a librarian before retiring early, though I left out the loneliness that had since crept into my days. Over the weeks, we kept bumping into each other at the store. Sometimes it was a quick hello in passing. Other times we lingered, chatting about books, movies, or the absurd price of organic produce. It became something I looked forward to, though I told myself it was nothing more than harmless conversation. One rainy afternoon, we ended up in the cafe next to the grocery store. The weather had turned sharply cold, and he suggested warming up with a cup of coffee. I hesitated. Meeting for coffee seemed more deliberate, more personal, but his easy smile disarmed me. As we sat across from each other, sipping our drinks, the conversation flowed effortlessly. He had a way of making me laugh, his stories peppered with wit and charm. But what struck me most was how he listened, really listened, as though every word I said mattered. "I can't imagine being a librarian," he said at one point. "You must have endless patience." I smiled. "It's not as quiet as people think. Kids asking for help with homework, teenagers trying to sneak in without a library card. It kept me on my toes." "Sounds like you miss it," he said, his eyes meeting mine. I paused, caught off guard by how easily he seemed to see through me. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but I think I miss the people more than the job." He nodded thoughtfully. "Well, if it's any consolation, I'm glad I ran into you. Grocery shopping's a lot less boring now." My heart fluttered at his words, a feeling I quickly dismissed as silly. But as we said goodbye and I walked back to my car, I couldn't help but notice how the rain didn't seem so dreary anymore. It wasn't until I found myself lingering in the produce section longer than necessary, hoping to accidentally run into Daniel, that I began to suspect something had shifted within me. Our conversations had grown more frequent, spilling into longer coffee breaks and even the occasional text exchange. He would send me photos of meals he'd cooked or a meme about the ridiculousness of grocery shopping, and I'd respond with book recommendations or snippets of my day. It was during one of those texts, as I sat at my kitchen table, that I realized how much he had brightened my life. I found myself smiling more, my days punctuated by moments of genuine joy instead of the quiet monotony I'd grown used to. But it wasn't just the happiness he brought, it was the way he made me feel seen. With Daniel, I wasn't just a woman in her 50s with graying hair and laugh lines. I was someone worth talking to, someone he sought out and cared about. The realization crept up on me like a tide, subtle but undeniable. I was falling for him. The thought stopped me cold. I set my phone down and stared at the blank wall across from me. What was I doing? He was so much younger, vibrant in ways I hadn't felt in years. What could he possibly see in me beyond a kind friend or a motherly figure? The idea seemed preposterous, almost embarrassing. And yet, I couldn't ignore the flutter in my chest when he smiled at me, the warmth that lingered long after our encounters. I spent the rest of that evening in turmoil, pacing the living room and battling my emotions. I reminded myself of the realities, the judgment of others, the potential heartbreak, the absurdity of it all. But every argument felt hollow against the undeniable truth. I hadn't felt this alive in years. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I whispered the words aloud, testing their weight. I think I'm in love with him. They hung in the air, terrifying and exhilarating all at once. For the first time in a long time, my heart felt full, even if it was with a love I didn't know what to do with. The days that followed were a roller coaster of emotions. One moment, I felt a quiet thrill at the possibility of what my feelings for Daniel could mean. The next, I was gripped by shame and doubt, a nagging voice in my head telling me this was foolish. I had spent years crafting a life that was steady, predictable. Falling for someone, especially someone so much younger, threatened to unravel it all. I avoided the grocery store for a week, convincing myself that distance was the solution. But in his absence, the ache in my chest grew. I missed his laughter, the easy way he could turn my mood around with a single quip. More than that, I missed feeling like I mattered to someone in a way that was deeply personal. One evening, as I sorted through a stack of unopened mail, I caught sight of a card Daniel had given me, a thank you note for a book I'd recommended. His handwriting was uneven, almost boyish, and the words were simple but sincere. Thanks for sharing your favorites with me. It's rare to meet someone who gets me so well. The note was a lifeline, pulling me back to the moments that made my days with him special. But even as my heart swelled, my mind raced with questions. Was I misinterpreting our connection? Did he simply see me as a kind mentor, a friend with no romantic undertones? The weight of societal judgment loomed large as well. What would people think if they saw us together? Would they see a vibrant, growing bond, or a woman desperately clinging to youth? I confided in no one, partly out of fear and partly because I couldn't bear to hear the words "too old" spoken aloud. I carried the secret alone, analyzing every interaction, looking for clues in his smile, his gestures, the warmth in his voice. One rainy afternoon, I saw him walking into the bookstore near my neighborhood. I hesitated for a moment before following him inside. He greeted me with the same familiar energy, his face lighting up in a way that made my doubts momentarily quiet. We wandered the aisles together, talking about everything and nothing. When I mentioned an old favorite novel, he pulled it from the shelf and added it to his growing stack of books without a second thought. It was in those small gestures, his attentiveness, the way he leaned in when I spoke, that I felt the undeniable undercurrent between us. Maybe it was one-sided. Maybe it wasn't. But the possibility was enough to keep me hoping. That evening, as I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, I barely recognized the woman looking back. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright with a mixture of fear and hope. For the first time in years, I felt alive, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to let that go no matter the risks. The idea began as a whisper, a fleeting thought I tried to push away. But the more time I spent replaying our moments together, the more it grew into something I couldn't ignore. I wanted to see him again, somewhere quieter, more personal. Inviting him to my home was a bold step, one that felt both thrilling and terrifying. I wrestled with it for days, pacing the small rooms of my house and rehearsing reasons why it would make sense. Perhaps I could suggest he borrow a book I had mentioned, or ask for his help with something around the house. But as much as I tried to frame it as casual, I knew the truth. I wanted him in my space, in my world, to see a part of me that no one else had seen in years. One morning, as I stood by the kitchen window sipping tea, I caught sight of a small garden in my backyard. The roses I had tended for years were in full bloom, their soft pink petals glowing in the sunlight. Inspiration struck. The garden could be my excuse. I could ask for his opinion on what to plant next, or offer to share some of the herbs I had grown. It was a safe enough reason, but it also felt authentic, a way to invite him into a piece of my life that mattered to me. The next time I saw him, I felt my pulse quicken. He was at the grocery store again, his arms full of vegetables and a loaf of bread. I approached him with a smile that I hoped hid my nerves. "Daniel," I began, keeping my tone light, "I was wondering if you might like to see my garden sometime. I've got some basil and mint that need thinning, and I thought you might enjoy taking some home." He blinked, surprised, before his face broke into that familiar, warm grin. "I'd love that. I've actually been thinking about starting my own little herb patch." His enthusiasm disarmed me, and for a moment, I forgot my apprehension. We set a date for the weekend, and as I walked home, my emotions oscillated between excitement and dread. The house suddenly felt too small, too cluttered. I spent the next 2 days cleaning every corner, fluffing cushions, and arranging flowers in vases. It was as if preparing the space could calm the storm of emotions inside me. By the time Saturday arrived, I was a bundle of nerves. The table on the patio was set with 2 mugs and a teapot, the garden freshly pruned and gleaming in the sunlight. I checked my reflection in the mirror one last time, smoothing down my dress and telling myself to breathe. When the doorbell rang, my heart skipped. As I opened the door and saw him standing there, a bouquet of wildflowers in his hand, I realized I had crossed an invisible line. Inviting him into my home wasn't just about sharing a garden or a cup of tea. It was about opening a door to something I could no longer deny. The moment Daniel stepped into my home, I could feel an electric charge pass between us. It wasn't just the warmth of the late afternoon sun streaming through the windows. It was the quiet intimacy of being alone together, in a space that was mine, yet somehow felt shared in a way I hadn't experienced in years. He placed the bouquet of wildflowers on the table with a smile, his eyes scanning the room with a softness that made my heart flutter. "You have a lovely home," he said, his voice low and sincere. "Thank you," I replied, my throat tightening. I wasn't sure if I was responding to his words or the way they made me feel, like I was something worth noticing again. He moved toward the garden door, admiring the rows of basil, mint, and rosemary I had carefully cultivated. "I can't believe how beautiful it all looks," he marveled. "I've always wanted to have a garden like this. There's something peaceful about being surrounded by plants." I nodded, watching him from the doorway. He moved with a kind of grace, a quiet energy that seemed to make the world slow down. My thoughts began to drift, as they always did when I was near him, wondering what it would be like to let myself feel this way without hesitation. We spent the next hour among the herbs, talking about our favorite plants and sharing stories of our lives. His laughter was easy, and I found myself laughing more than I had in months. There was no pretense between us, just 2 people, enjoying each other's company in a quiet corner of the world. At one point, he reached down to clip a sprig of rosemary and handed it to me, his fingers brushing mine as he did. A simple touch, but it felt like a promise, something unspoken yet deeply understood. When we finally moved inside, I made tea, and we sat at the table in the soft, golden light. I watched as he settled into the chair across from me, his presence both comforting and exhilarating. "Do you mind if I ask you something?" he asked, his gaze locking onto mine. There was a curiosity in his eyes, but also something more, something tender. "Of course," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why do you always seem so—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Solitary." The question struck me like a sudden gust of wind, sharp and unexpected. I wasn't sure how to answer, or if I even could. My life had been solitary, yes, by choice and by circumstance. I had embraced it, thinking it was easier than dealing with the complexities of relationships. But now, sitting across from him, I realized how much I had missed the company of another person, how much I longed for it. "I suppose I've just gotten used to being alone," I said, my voice steady, though I could feel the vulnerability rising in my chest. It's comfortable, but sometimes, I wonder what it would be like to not be. He didn't say anything at first. His eyes softened as he studied me, as if seeing me in a way I had never been seen before. "I don't think you're meant to be alone," he said quietly, his voice a tender caress. I felt the weight of his words settle in my heart, and in that moment, everything shifted. The walls I had built, the layers of self-protection, seemed to crumble, not all at once but just enough to allow something new to take root. There, in the quiet of my home, surrounded by the aroma of herbs and the hum of our conversation, I realized that what I had with Daniel was more than friendship, more than a fleeting connection. It was something deeper, something I wasn't ready to let go of. And I wasn't sure what it all meant yet, but I knew that for the first time in a long time, I was willing to find out. Our feelings, unspoken but understood, hung in the air like the scent of fresh basil, lingering between us, offering the promise of something more. Later that evening, after Daniel had left, I found myself sitting by the window, the cool breeze brushing against my skin, as if nature itself were offering me a quiet solace. The house, once so familiar, now felt different, alive, in a way I hadn't allowed it to be in years. The silence of the room was no longer oppressive. Instead, it seemed to hold a space for my thoughts, my feelings, and the inexplicable shift within me. My mind was full of the moments we had shared, the laughter, the subtle touches, the way his gaze lingered just a little longer than necessary, making my heart race in the most unexpected of ways. I hadn't realized until then how much I had been hiding from myself. The woman who had spent years making her peace with solitude, the woman who had told herself that love was something she had outgrown, was still very much alive. But there was something different now, something that defied the years, the expectations, the labels of society. The question that haunted me was simple, yet profound. Could I really let myself love him, knowing what others would think? Age was a cruel measure, wasn't it? I had never considered myself old, never saw myself as a woman defined by the calendar or the ticking of the clock. But there were moments, in the presence of a younger man like Daniel, when it all seemed to matter. The years between us, the life experience he hadn't yet lived, and the memories I had built, some sweet and others bittersweet. But when I thought of him, when I remembered his smile, the way he made me feel seen, truly seen, all of those doubts faded into the background. In his eyes, I wasn't a woman whose best years were behind her. I was someone worth getting to know, someone worth being with. Love, I realized, had no expiration date. It didn't care about age or time or the opinions of others. Love simply existed in the space between two souls willing to connect, to feel, to be vulnerable together. And in that moment, I knew that what I felt for Daniel was not just infatuation. It was something deeper. It was a connection I couldn't ignore, no matter how much fear or uncertainty lingered in the corners of my mind. I thought about the countless women I knew who had settled, who had let the years pass without ever asking for what they truly wanted. I wondered, too, how many of them had simply given up on the idea of romance, of real, messy, passionate love. Was it possible that in our desperation to protect ourselves from pain, we locked away a part of us that was meant to be free? I had spent years hiding from love, afraid that the heartache would be too much to bear. But now, with Daniel, I was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, love was the thing that had been waiting for me all along. Waiting for me to take that leap, to embrace something more than safety, more than routine. As I sat there, feeling the coolness of the evening air, I realized that love wasn't just about the other person. It was about allowing myself to feel again, to open myself up to the possibility of joy, of adventure, of surrender. And for the first time in years, I felt hope stir inside me. Hope for the future, hope for the unknown, and most of all, hope for the love I could still find, even at this stage of my life. I didn't know where it would lead, or what the world would say. But I knew that, with Daniel, I was willing to take the journey. The following weeks unfolded with a quiet certainty, like the gradual blooming of a flower that had waited for the right moment. Each time I saw Daniel, whether in the grocery store or over coffee at the small cafe near my house, I felt a sense of peace in my heart that I hadn't known I was missing. Our connection deepened, not through grand gestures, but in the way we quietly understood each other. There was an ease between us that felt entirely natural, no need to explain, no need to apologize for the unspoken boundaries of our age. We spoke about everything and nothing. Sometimes, we sat in silence, simply existing in the same space, the mere proximity enough to fill the air with a gentle warmth. And when we did speak, I found myself laughing, genuinely laughing, in a way I hadn't in years. Daniel brought out a side of me I thought had been buried long ago, playful, unguarded, willing to let go of the past and embrace the present. He came over to my house one evening, and the atmosphere was different. The familiar stillness of my home now felt charged, alive with possibility. He hadn't been there long before I realized something profound. It wasn't about how he looked or the age gap between us. It was about how he made me feel, like I was seen in a way no one had ever seen me before. He didn't look at me through the lens of years or judgments or expectations. He looked at me as I was as a person, and that was more than enough. As we talked, our hands brushed lightly on the table, and I felt a flutter in my chest, an entirely unfamiliar sensation, but one that made me feel alive. And in that moment, I understood that love didn't come with an expiration date. Love was simply love, raw, pure, and unguarded. It didn't care about the years between us. It cared only about the connection that had bloomed so unexpectedly in the midst of the ordinary. We shared a kiss that night, and though it was soft and tentative, it held the weight of everything we hadn't yet said, everything we hadn't yet explored. It was the beginning of something new, something unexpected, and yet something that felt more real than I could have ever imagined. Sitting there, after he left, with the faint scent of him still lingering in the room, I realized something that shifted everything inside me. Love, at any stage in life, has the power to renew us. It has the power to awaken parts of ourselves we didn't even know were asleep. Age, time, societal expectations, they are all just constructs. They are not the truth of who we are or what we deserve. As I reflected on the journey we had begun, I found myself smiling softly. The world might have its judgments, but love was something that no one could define but those who felt it. I had spent so many years waiting for life to come to me, for love to somehow find its way into my life. But now I understood. Love isn't something that happens when you least expect it. Love happens when you're ready to embrace it, to let go of the fears that have kept you from living fully. And so with Daniel, I was living again. Not just existing, but truly living, filled with hope, with joy, and most of all, with a love that had no boundaries, no age, no expiration. I had found my spark in the ordinary, and I would never let it go.